Good morning, folks. How are you? We're going to get started here in just a minute. We're just about 5 minutes out, waiting for folks to join.
Excellent, thanks.
Good morning, everyone. All of you here win the punctuality award because it is 9 o'clock on the dot. We are just going to give folks another minute or two to amble in, and then we're going to start the meeting. So hang tight. Good morning, everyone. I think we're going to go ahead and get started. Linda, can you begin reporting the meeting, please?
Will do.
Thank you. So, I hope that's recording. Great. Good morning, everyone. My name is Rebecca Smith. I'm a senior analyst at Oregon Department of Energy, or ODO, and I am our subject matter expert on all things hydrogen. So today, there should be an agenda available online on the webpage where we included information about how to register for this meeting. Jessica, perhaps you can drop that link in the chat in case you haven't seen it. The goal of today's meeting is to bring folks up to date on what's happening around a potential Pacific Northwest application for a regional clean hydrogen hub. So ODO has teamed up with Business Oregon in this endeavor, and so you'll hear from both of us today. I want to introduce some folks from ODO who are on the line. So we have Linda Ross, who is online, and you can message her privately if you'd like. She is handling all of the technical matters today. And then we also have Jessica Rikers, who is going to be helping me in keeping an eye on folks with their hands up, and keeping the discussion guided. And I'll get into a little bit more of how the meeting is going to run here in just a second. So So yeah, so the agenda is we're gonna all gonna do our introductions. Business Oregon is gonna say a few words, and then I'm going to talk about what the Regional Clean Hydrogen Hub opportunity is. And I'm not going to go into a ton of detail in that there's a lot of information out there publicly. And if that's an area that you're not as up to date as you'd like, then by all means, you can reach out to me or to the Renewable Hydrogen Alliance. And I'm happy to walk you through that in greater detail, because I'd really like to spend more time on, what I think is the meat of today's work, which is trying to give you as much insight on what's happening at the Pacific Northwest Hydrogen Association as possible. And then we're going to have a guided discussion because we'd really like to hear from you about how Odo can best represent Oregon interests on the executive board at the Pacific Northwest Hydrogen Association, and which I'm going to start referring to as the association today. And then, get your feedback on what you'd like to see in a hub in general. So Odo, if you don't know us, we're the state's energy office. We have a mission that we've recently updated through some strategic planning. I'm not going to read all of this, but basically we're here to provide, a central repository of data about energy. And a big part of the work that we do is education and technical assistance and outreach. So today, for the meeting, how we'd like to run it is we have panelists, which is essentially me and Business Oregon, and then attendees. And we have some community agreements that we were exposed to at another meeting, and we found them a really useful way to frame how we'd like everyone to approach today. And so these are here, to be present and ready to learn, to be respectful to others, and especially remember the idea that learning often happens outside of our comfort zones. So to listen, to learn first, and then to supply information or perspective second. And as I mentioned, Linda Ross is here for all your technical issues, and please apologies in advance for any hiccups. For example, I know that getting the registrations done today for today were a little bit, we had some technical issues there. I apologize. WebEx is not the most user-friendly platform. I'll just leave it at that. So the objective of today's workshop, as I said, is to share information about what's going on around this hub opportunity, and really to hear your questions that we might be able to answer today, or that we might take back to the executive board at the association, and to really also hear your feedback. So there's, first I'm going to give a presentation. First, we're going to hear from Business Oregon, and then I'm going to give a presentation. During that presentation, absolutely, please feel free to ask clarifying questions about the content I'm going over. And you can do that one of two ways. You can throw it into the chat, or you can raise your hand and Jessica will call on you. I'm also going to stop every few slides and see if there are any clarifying questions. And we'd like to hold off on the discussion until after the presentation is over. I've tried to keep it relatively short so you don't have to listen to me talk. And then when we get to that discussion, we do have some discussion questions that were included in the agenda. Those are really a jumping off point, and we need not hold the discussion to those topics specifically. So there is an opportunity to move beyond them. So during the discussion, if you have a question or a comment that you want to make, you can use the raise hand function. As mentioned, Jessica Reichers is our moderator, and she'll call on you. Now, one way that might hinder kind of an organic discussion is if we're discussing a specific issue and you want to address that issue specifically as opposed to moving on to another issue, then we'll ask that that you make that clear in the chat. Say I want to talk about this specifically. We're trying to balance keeping it from becoming kind of a free for all where we don't get to hear anyone because we're hearing from everyone at the same time, but also to facilitate discussion. So we'll see how that works. And then absolutely, I'm your point person for this discussion. And all things related to the hub at Odo. So if you have any, if you wish to follow up with me afterwards, please don't hesitate to reach out. WebEx, everyone's favorite platform. If you're not familiar with it, I envy you. So there are a couple of different raise hand options. You can do it down here at the bottom with the reactions. There's a raise hand option. There's a second place you can do it, which is here. If you look at that participant list and you see yourself, you should be able to raise your hand. We are using the chat functionality today, so you can ask a specific question in there. Or, when we're in the discussion, you can also say, hey, I don't neglect me. I want to talk about this specific issue. We're asking everyone to keep their microphones off unless recognized. You can have your camera on or off. Leave that up to you. And so first, I would like to give it over to our friends at Business Oregon. Mark, are you here?
Yep, I'm here.
Wonderful. You have the floor.
Thank you, Rebecca. Good morning, everybody. My name is Mark Brady. I am an innovation strategist with Business Oregon. For those who don't know, Business Oregon is the state economic development agency. I just want to be brief this morning and say hello to everyone and let you know that we're happy to be here as a co-sponsor of this effort with Odo, although definitely Odo is in the lead on this. So go to Rebecca first, and she knows a lot more on this topic than I do. Just a little bit about our role and how we might be able to contribute. I'm part of our innovation and entrepreneurship team. We're the team that's always looking at what is going to be coming next for Oregon's economy. Where can we help emerging early stage businesses or new technologies get a hold in Oregon to our state's economic advantage? In addition to the innovation side of things, we also have regional staff, we have recruitment staff, we have infrastructure people, we have business finance people, all of which can be brought to bear on particular projects. We have, I believe, an active recruitment project related to hydrogen as we speak. So this is a real thing now for us, not just theoretical. So whenever opportunities come up, we will draw on our variety of expertise across the agencies to help however we can. So happy to be here, happy to contribute how I can. If anybody has follow-up questions about Business Oregon, let me know. I'll drop my email in the chat and you can reach out to me whenever you'd like. But thanks for joining.
And thank you, Mark. Business Oregon has been an incredible help in terms of getting this off the ground, and then certainly helping us identify folks in Oregon who might be interested to be here today. So I want to talk first about the Regional Clean Hydrogen Hub opportunity in general. So when the infrastructure bill passed, the federal infrastructure bill in 2021, that included $8 billion in funding for what were called regional clean hydrogen hubs. And we've heard now a few communications from US DOE about what this grant opportunity is going to look like. They had an RFI last year, and then they've had another RFI this February, and then they had a notice of intent this summer. And where we're at with it is that we're waiting on the actual funding opportunity announcement, or FOA, to drop. So we've started to hear some details along the way from DOE about what it's going to look like, but of course they've said this could change at any moment. So we're all on tenterhooks waiting for that FOA to really know what the opportunity will specifically look like. However, some things are coming into view that seem like they're going to be the case. So for example, we've heard that it looks like there's the possibility for $500 million to $1 billion per hub. That's a lot of money. And this is all part of DOE's hydrogen shot. So they've got this goal of getting to $1 per 1 kilogram of clean hydrogen in 1 decade. So that's their 1-1-1 goal. And whereas in Oregon, for example, Odo has been working on a renewable hydrogen study, DOE approaches this technology agnostic. They're looking specifically at greenhouse gas emissions to determine what is quote unquote clean hydrogen. And so that means that they're open to, feedstocks, including renewable electricity, nuclear powered electricity, or nuclear or thermal energy from nuclear, and fossil fuels, specifically natural gas paired with carbon capture and storage. So they're allowing all of those technologies to compete for this funding, but they do have a carbon intensity threshold. So for the hub applications, it's expected that proposals are going to have to address each part of the value chain. So this is include the production of hydrogen, the transport of it from production to end user, storage along the way, and then the end user part of the hydrogen life cycle. So we refer to these as make, move, store, and use. So a competitive hub application is going to successfully address all of those. And the reason for this in the way that they've built this opportunity is that their overall goal is to really try to create that marketplace for clean hydrogen, kind of from whole cloth. And so you may have heard that there's sometimes a chicken and egg issue identified with this emerging market, where it's difficult to get it produced because there are no end users, but there's no end users because nobody's producing it. And so this is their approach to try to address both ends of that. So that FOA that we're all waiting on, we're expecting that DOE said September or October. So we're waiting on that. I've heard all manner of rumor about when that might drop. And at least what they identified this summer as what the likely application process would be is that the first step is that you would have to submit a concept paper, and you would have, I believe, probably 4 to 6 weeks to turn that around. And then DOE would review all of those concept papers and then invite certain hub proponents to do a full application. So if you weren't invited, you can submit an application, but I don't think your chances are going to be great. So as I mentioned, DOE has done some outreach on clean hydrogen in general. So this, one of their earlier RFIs, this was one of the findings slides that they published. And this shows information from all of the responses that they got. And you can expect that this is going to be fairly representative of the breadth of applicants that we're going to see for this funding opportunity. Pardon me, as I mentioned, it's a lot of money. We're expecting it to be highly competitive. So there's already been announcements from a number of states or groups of states. My understanding is California is doing their own work. We've got some New England states together, some central US states. But as you can see here, what they found out from their RFI for the Pacific Northwest was that there was a lot of interest among tribal communities around ports. And then, of course, one of our great competitive advantages for this region is our plentiful renewable electricity resources. So here are some specifics about what DOE learned. So certainly they heard a lot about potential sites in Washington and Oregon. So these include Port of Tacoma, Richland, Boardman, and Centralia. That there's a fair bit of emission reduction potential here, due in no small part to our clean electricity resources, and that there are some opportunities for co-location, including on tribal land. So before I dive into the organization created to lead Pacific Northwest Hub application, I want to pause and see if there are any questions about just the opportunity in general.
Rebecca, I don't see any questions and I don't see any hands raised right now, but feel free to shoot your questions into the chat or even just shoot into the chat that you have a question, and I'll make sure to get you on the list whenever Rebecca takes a pause like this.
Ken.
Hey, I was at a conference when a very highly placed US DOE person adamantly corrected me when I called this a grant. I think she said they were going to be cooperative agreements. And that was obviously a really big deal to her. I don't totally know what the difference is, but I just thought I'd mention that.
Thank you, Ken. Cooperative agreement. Okay. Okay. Kate, you have a question? Oh, you're on mute.
Sorry, I'm really good at Zoom and I'm not good at WebEx yet. Thank you. I just wanted to respond to that. I think the main difference, just as context between a grant and a cooperative agreement, is a grant is typically when a funding agency says, here's money, you direct the project and tell us and report back to us, but you really have ownership. And cooperative agreements have far more input, oversight, and engagement by the program managers of the federal funding agency. Oh, Michelle just put that in there. So essentially, it just means that there's a lot more engagement by DOE in the planning and design of the work as it continues versus where they just say, here's your money, go do great things.
Thank you for that clarification, Kate and Michelle. And like I said, I went over the information here pretty briefly. If you go back to the notice of intent, there's more information on their proposed phases of the cooperative agreement. There is an expectation that there will be a 50% match requirement. There's a lot more detail in there. So certainly follow up with me if you'd like more information on that. And then I saw a question about the slide deck, and we will be able to make that available. I will just raise one question right now, or one concern is that, so our overall goal with this convening was to, really get Oregon stakeholders informed and ready to participate, and also to get your feedback and ensure that this hub opportunity is, in the vision that we're hoping. So because this is such a competitive opportunity, we're trying to walk the line between being public and open, but then also trying to ensure that we're not, giving away the store to our competitors. And so there's nothing in this presentation today that I think would be problematic to have the slides released publicly. Going forward, though, and especially when we're in the discussion, this might be an idea to talk about, is kind of how do we potentially have discussions looking forward that might include information that isn't necessarily confidential, but is sensitive in that, it is a little bit competitive with other potential hubs. So I'll leave that there.
Rebecca, we had another question from Tom. Will the hub funding require 50-50 match from regional entities?
Tom, so my understand, again, it'll be final when we see the FOA, but they have said that they were expecting a 50% match, and that could not include any other federal government funds. So the match, I think the expectation is that the match would come from, kind of be split across the project proponents. But that hasn't been finalized either. So as we as the IIJA came out and the understanding of this huge opportunity became clear before the association was formed, there were already discussions going on between Washington and Oregon. These were led by an organization called Charge, which is an innovation cluster, public-private. I hope I'm describing it correctly, and it's associated with WSU in Washington. And so Charge was leading the conversation. Odo and a few other Oregon entities were participating. And then Jay Inslee sent a letter about the opportunity and directed Washington Department of Commerce to create an organization, which also was in a law passed in Washington and funding allocated for Washington to create this organization, the Pacific Northwest Hydrogen Association, with the goal that it would coordinate the development of the hub proposal. And then if the proposal were successful and received funding, that the association would then also be the lead on managing that contract. So the association was incorporated in April in Washington with $2 million in funding from the Washington State Legislature. The association is staffed by the Washington Department of Commerce. It has an executive board and I can't believe I forgot the word. Anyway, and a committee, which I'll go over in a moment. Advisory committee. Thank you. I'm undercaffeinated. I apologize. So even as the association was putting together its executive board and the advisory committee, Washington Commerce staff put together a request for information or an RFI to start getting a sense of what kind of interest was out there in projects. The executive board was formed in June. Odo holds a seat on the board, our agency director, Janine Benner, and Janine is also the vice chair of the board. So the board started meeting in July, and so the meetings thus far have been focused on not only the structure of the association in terms of antitrust statements and, incorporation and officers, but also, further development of concept ideas for the hub, drafting project grading criteria, getting an M&O contractor secured, and and looking to open up a second RFI. So Jessica, I feel like I've seen some questions in the chat. Are these clarifying questions that we should pause for now?
We do have one additional question, from Jed, and he asks if we could describe our interaction with Washington a little bit.
Yeah, I'm happy to. So as the bill in the Washington legislature that ended up, getting the funding for the association, and as the association kind of began to coalesce as an idea, and then as an incorporated organization, Oregon had been involved in these conversations with Washington, as I mentioned, since last year. And there was a sense that even though regional wasn't defined in the Infrastructure Act, we really got a sense that there would be a lot of strength for Washington and Oregon to team up on this opportunity. We also had conversations with some other states in the Northwest to see what the interest was and kind of what this group might look like. And we certainly heard interest from some other states, though they were a little bit farther behind in their hydrogen journey. And so they, weren't sure that they were really ready to sign on to a hub concept. So it's my understanding at this point is it's Washington and Oregon. Washington is already more organized than Oregon in terms of its hydrogen, in terms of its hydrogen support. It's already, there's already work there in terms of organizing the stakeholders. A lot of the hydrogen stakeholders in Washington know each other, have kind of already forming those ideas of connections between their various projects, which in many ways was the impetus for this convening of Oregon stakeholders, was for us to really try to reach that level of organization ourselves. So the interaction with Washington has been very, congenial, very welcoming. I think though that there's definitely, because Washington has put up the $2 million to fund the application process, because the association was incorporated in Washington, and because Washington is a little bit ahead of Oregon in some respects, with hydrogen, it's definitely shaking out to be, more Washington focused than Oregon.
And Rebecca, I have a question from Martina, and she asks, will the Pacific Northwest Hydrogen Coalition have public meetings? And can you share more about the role of the advisory board committee for that?
I have slides on the advisory committee, so I'll get to that. I'm not sure what the intention is with respect to public meetings or not. So I think when we get to the discussion, that's something that we can bring up as well, in terms of what are the questions that Odo can take to the executive board on behalf of all of you. And so certainly what their plan is for public interaction, I agree, should certainly be part of that.
And that's it that I have for questions or hands raised right now. Some of the things that, oh, another question just popped up. I just wanted to flag that I put the notice of intent into the meeting chat. So if you want to go look at it, you can see that.
Thank you so much, Jessica.
Absolutely. Kelly just asked, given what you just said about Oregon-Washington relationship, is it possible that the Pacific Northwest application would not include Oregon?
I don't, that's a great question, and that's certainly something that we can get into more during the discussion. If there are other concerns around that, I don't think that's going to be the case. Could the application be heavily skewed towards Washington? I think that that's absolutely a possibility, which again was part of the impetus of this convening. But Odo has been very active in terms of trying to make sure that there's Oregon representation at the association. And we've certainly, haven't heard any sense of exclusion of Oregon. And frankly, from a strategic standpoint, I don't think that that would be in Washington's best interest. I think that if a number of Oregon interests felt left out and decided to form their own hub concept and applied, I think that that could render both concepts as less competitive. But we can get into that in the discussion. So as I mentioned, Odo has a seat on the board at the association. So there are 18 board members, and the list of that is available on the Pacific Northwest Hydrogen Association website. And I just wanted to give you kind of a quick breakdown of what the board looks like organizationally. So we've got we've got 3 labor entities, 2 state government entities. Washington Department of Commerce's director, Lisa Brown, is the chair, and Odo's director, Janine Benner, is the vice chair. 2 oil and gas companies, 3 utilities, 2 different tribal representatives, and then I've got this kind of catch-all other. And so it really includes 1 advocacy nonprofit, which is the Sierra Club. We've got Amazon, Charge, which I mentioned was initially leading the conversation around a hub, a couple of hydrogen industry companies and an engineering firm. So as you can see, this is other than Odo, this is pretty much all Washington on the board. So that's certainly a question that we've raised with the association, and we're looking to see if it's possible to add more entities, specifically Oregon entities, to the board. So we have that question into them. Greg, I just saw your question. So, they've seemed very open to it. I think my understanding is that they were going to put it to a vote to the board. I'll have to double check on that. But, certainly didn't immediately hear an outright no. So as Martina mentioned, so there's an executive board and then there's an advisory committee. So sometimes it's referred to as an advisory board because that's how it was originally conceived, though now it's being referred to as an advisory committee. And so when the Washington Department of Commerce invited folks to apply for the executive board, they also invited folks to apply for this committee. And they pretty much accepted anyone who submitted the application materials requested. And I apologize for the baying dogs in the backyard, by the way. So there are 58 accepted members at this time. Many of them are RFI respondents. There has been a question at the executive board as to whether to add more advisory committee members, because we've gotten some other kind of late expressions of interest. So the members thus far, predominantly 33% are from either advocacy, NGOs, or lobbyists. 30% are from industry. A quarter of them are from governments or utilities or ports or transit boards, and then 13% from academia. And so the goal is that, 58, possibly more members is pretty unwieldy for a single committee. So the goal is to allow advisory committee members to self-select into 12 different subcommittees. And I think the goal is to have 12 members per committee. So that's why we might allow more folks to join. And these subcommittees, ideas were developed with the actual hub application in mind. And so you see, I've got the list of those 12 here. So they run the gamut from everything from business development, permitting and safety, end use, transport, production, and so on. Do I have any questions right now?
Hey, Rebecca, I've got one from Chris. You might be addressing it later in your slides, but he wanted to know, does the executive board approve projects to be included in the application, just a majority vote, or how does the approval process work?
I am going to get back to project selection, so I'll leave that. But thus far, the executive board does vote on members on matters, and thus far it's all been by a voice vote, and they've all been unanimous. So I'm assuming that it is in fact majority rules.
Oh, I just had something pop up here from Ryan, who says it would be good to have a labor subcommittee. I don't see that one up in there or up on there, so many of us would be involved if possible, I would imagine.
Yes.
And go ahead, Rebecca. I'm sorry. I have one more question that just came in too.
Sorry, I'm just trying to, I have so many windows open. So let's see. So yeah, no, there is no labor committee. So that's a great suggestion. And then Jessica, did you say that there was more?
I have one more question from Matt, who says, is the intake process closed for executive board membership as well? Are you considering additional members of the board beyond the conversation on Oregon entities? And what is the process to join if interested?
So that is an area that we will get back to you with more information. As I said, we have raised the question of, could we could we add some Oregon specific board members? So I think the discussion at the board level will include whether or not to open the board to not only more Oregon membership, but in general. And so that's what I will report back on once I have an answer. And then what the process would be for that, I don't know yet. I don't know if it would be the same process or if folks would be invited to join. So I'll have to get back to you when I know more on that.
I gave a thumbs up, and that's all I've got right now.
Great, thank you. So for the advisory committee, the role of it as it's been envisioned thus far is to really serve as a focus group of experts and to provide input to the executive board, specifically on decision making and tactical actions. Perhaps also provide input into the M&O contractor, which I'll get to shortly, which I believe stands for management and organization. But also to serve as a conduit to stakeholders, to do some of that outreach to communities, companies, and organizations, and provide that avenue for outreach and dissemination of information about the hub. So advisory committee members may be asked to develop and or review elements of the hub application. If that is the case, they will be asked to sign an NDA. And as I mentioned, those 12 subcommittees, the way that they're going to be structured is that each subcommittee would have a chair, and then each subcommittee would also have a board liaison. And so that would help with the communication between the advisory committee and the board. Any questions about this?
I don't see any questions or any hands raised.
All right, on to projects and selections. So as I mentioned, even as the association was being formed, it's staffed by Washington Department of Commerce. And so Commerce put together that first request for information. So that wasn't, I had a lot of questions about that kind of early on in the board meetings. And unfortunately, we just didn't have a lot of information about how it was created because we weren't included in that. So the goal, though, of the first RFI, as we were told, was to really get a sense of the landscape, what's out there in terms of potential projects, interested parties, how things might fit together. And this was done with the understanding that this wouldn't be the only opportunity to get information on potential projects. So in that first RFI, there were 76 complete responses. And so the majority of those projects were in Washington and the Puget Sound region. There were a number of them in Eastern Washington. There certainly were Oregon projects as well. Over half of the responses were from private for-profit entities, but also over 20% of responses came from government entities. Any questions about that first RFI?
Kelly, I think you started to write a question. Do you want to just come off mute and, oh, there it is. Kelly wants to know, what is a quote complete response unquote mean?
Great question. I was really hoping nobody was going to ask that. Since this is information we got from Commerce, I'm assuming that a complete application was probably most of the information. I'm going to guess that didn't mean that you answered every single question, because if you looked at the RFI, it was prodigious in its requests for information. But certainly people were told that even if they didn't have all of their project information locked down to at least complete a little bit of it as, you know, as a way to get yourself on the radar. And then also there were concerns from some potential applicants about confidentiality. And since that hadn't been finalized and communicated to anyone, Odo heard from some project proponents that they weren't comfortable putting in all of their details. So I don't know kind of where that cutoff was for complete versus incomplete, but I have a feeling that it wasn't every single field need to be filled out, but you gave, you know, a fair bit of information.
Okay, Rebecca, we've got another question from Michelle. She asks, have initial RFI responses or at least identities of respondents been made public? If not, how are the participants in a regional approach expected to coordinate with each other? Or does the association intend that all coordination goes through it?
That's a great question. I certainly haven't, you know, as I am staffing Director Benner as for her work on the executive board, and we haven't seen all of the names or any of the names of the project applicants. The only applicants I know of are the ones who have told me directly that they have applied. So I would add that, you know, to the questions that we take back to the association and perhaps for our discussion as well, if we'd like to propose to them how we would like to see things go. Certainly the association is aware that there hasn't been a lot of transparency up to now, and there have been discussions around how to be more transparent, how to get information out there. So I think that if, you know, if we today want to discuss some, you know, potential ideas of what we would really like to see or what we think is critical for us to see, then I think that that would be a good use of our time.
Thanks, Rebecca. I've got a couple more questions for you here.
Sure.
Kelly asks, did you say what the split of those 76 responses were between Oregon and Washington? Do you have a breakdown on that?
I don't have a breakdown. All I know is that most of them were in Washington.
Great. And then Matt asks, who is the M&O contractor? Can you elaborate on what their role would be?
Yes, this is the slide for that. But also no, I can't answer your first question only because I don't know if the contracting is complete. I believe that that the association is in the process of finalizing the contracting with its selected M&O contractor. And so I think that that is going to be made public as soon as that is all completed. However, the board had a meeting yesterday, and so we did get to hear from the selected contractor and hear about their approach to this, their experience in hydrogen, their experience in managing multi-million-dollar government contracts. You know, looking forward to hopefully being able to make that public soon. And that's a question I can take back to the board as well, is when are we expecting to be able to make that public? And so here on the bottom half of the slide, pardon me, is a little bit more information. So Department of Commerce issued an RFQ through state government procurement processes for the M&O contractor this summer. It closed in August, and they moved really quickly to select the candidate. So the scope of work is for the contractor to lead the hub planning and application development. That's considered phase 1. And then also to lead the hub construction and deployment if the hub application is successful. And so that's being called phase 2. Up top on the slide, though, too, is the project selection committee. So this is another committee formed by the association. And so this is separate from the executive board. It was decided that because there are project applicants on the executive board, that due to antitrust issues, it would be better to have a separate project selection committee. They would all be, all signing NDAs, all working in what's called a clean room format for sharing confidential information, but maintaining its security. The There has been developed project grading criteria. It's in draft form right now, with the goal that once we actually saw the FOA, and then with input from the M&O contractor and from the project selection committee, that we would finalize that project grading criteria. I don't know what the goal is for that, to make that public or not, or to make that or to communicate that to the advisory committees. I would hope that it would be communicated to the advisory committee, but I don't have any sense of how that's going to work yet. I do know that their goal is to come back to the executive board once they've finalized it, to have a vote on it. Any more questions about M&O or the project selection committee?
We've got one from Ken who asks, are we providing input to the criteria, or is that closed to the public?
I think that's something that we can discuss here today. We can discuss, one, if we want to, if you want to make a request, that be allowed, that be taken into account, or if we want to even suggest some specifically from our discussion here today. Ken, go ahead.
Searching for the mute button. I mean, this is kind of crazy. I mean, is Oregon involved or not involved? You don't even know whether we'll have input to the selection criteria. And by we, I mean like you and the advisory committee, which hasn't even met yet.
The executive board
feels very uncomfortable.
Sorry, I didn't mean to speak over you, Ken.
Oh, that's okay. It feels kind of like being cut out. I thought one of the purposes of this meeting was to suggest what folks in Oregon feel the criteria ought to emphasize. It's not even clear that we have input to it.
That is one of the goals for this meeting. That's why some of the discussion questions we included kind of, what are your thoughts on the hub concept and on criteria? We share those concerns at ODA. We've heard them from a lot of stakeholders. We certainly understand, the associations trying to keep things confidential and competitive, but also trying to figure out how to ensure that we're getting the right people involved, and the right feedback. I think that there is a real concern around timing. I've definitely heard the truism that, we're building the airplane as we're flying it. But so one of the big goals today was for us to hear from everybody about your concerns, about how you'd like to see your concerns addressed. And so, the executive board has seen the draft grading criteria. So we could certainly go back to the board with, asking that it be shared, with the advisory committee, or with stakeholders at large. That's all on the table for what we discussed today. And that's why we're here today, is because I want to hear these concerns, and we want to be able to ably represent you on the executive board.
I mean, if they have draft criteria without even having convened the advisory committee, it doesn't instill a lot of confidence in the process.
I definitely understand your concern. with respect to convening the advisory committee, my understanding that was a first communication was sent out to them, and that the goal was trying to get a first meeting in September, which was what they had promised. And so, or more communication. So my understanding is that there will be more communication to the advisory committee this month, so next week. But in terms of whether or not that's going, to include a first meeting, I'm not sure on that. Okay, so that was the information that I had to share today as part of the presentation. So we had on our agenda that this was going to go until for another 15-20 minutes, and then I had a break built in there. So I will ask of you guys right now, would you like to take a 5-10 minute break, or would you like to just jump right into the discussion? I think you can just write break or no break into the chat, and I'll make Jessica be mathy.
So far, we're 5 people, just want to jump right into discussion. I don't have anybody that says break.
Great.
So I didn't even have to be mathy.
There's still time. Okay, so these are the questions that I sent out as part of the agenda. And again, these are meant to be guiding discussion questions, but these don't have to be the only things that we talk about. Just as a reminder, the goal here today is to hear your questions, your concerns, and your suggestions. And we can have, you can tell those things to Odo and Business Oregon specifically, but also discussed amongst all of us. So I've broken them down kind of into, oops, that one was wrong. Anyway, the bottom header is wrong. It was just more how to use this opportunity. So, I think that we'll start with a question that I know that Ken's already got us started on, which is, what questions or concerns do you have around the Pacific Northwest Hydrogen Association, its executive board, or its advisory committee? Though I already see a hand from Greg. Why don't you just jump in, Greg?
Yep, I was just trying to get in the queue on that particular issue. So yeah, I share a lot of Ken's concerns. I mean, it feels like it hasn't been particularly transparent. It feels like Oregon's kind of been an afterthought. In a lot of ways, it would have been nice if Washington staff had been here today to talk with all of us about some of these issues instead of you having to kind of be providing the best information that you have, because I know you've had challenges getting good answers as well. It seems to me that there is a lot of process here, which in some ways is good. We need transparency. We need a good process that people can trust. At the same time, I think we're all expecting the DOE FOA to drop in the next, let's say, 1 to 4 weeks, maybe. I've heard plenty of different things. Some of them are conflicting, so I don't know, but it doesn't feel like a lot of time for advisory committees, subcommittees, consensus building, all those kinds of things. And I'm kind of wondering how they're going to take the information they're getting in their RFI that's due Monday and actually make decisions based on it in the time frame that a concept paper is due, which, as far as I know, is anywhere from 30 to 60 days after the FOA is dropped. So it just feels like there is a lot of process that's good, but also not a lot of clarity about how it's actually going to happen in the reality of timelines. And so I think that's one concern. And another concern is just that there actually be like a real Oregon element to it. Not that like there's a Oregon sort of token participation that they, throw in a little small electrolyzer somewhere or a very small element of a project somewhere, but that there actually be like a legitimate, sizable portion of the project that is in Oregon as well as Washington, because they have said a couple times that they're very interested in a legitimately regional project, and I think that benefits them. So those would be two things I would just highlight, that there actually be like a legitimate Oregon element to it, which is concerning for all the reasons that Ken has outlined too. And just kind of like reality of process here, it feels like decisions are going to have to get made pretty quickly. And it's not clear how that's going to happen given all the kind of lack of clarity about these different groups.
Thank you, Greg. Ken, is that your hand up anew or is that an old hand?
It's anew. It's anew.
Ooh.
I apologize, but
No, lay it on me.
so most people on the call probably know that we have a pretty involved hydrogen hub plan. It's got a lot of attributes that we think are attractive to DOE, and we didn't even design it that way. We just designed it, and that's how it turned out. And I imagine other folks on this call have projects that they're wanting included as part of the proposal. We certainly want ours included, but how do we make a decision not to separately propose our project to US DOE, given the lack of involvement, and we don't even know when we will know whether we're included or not included in the Commerce Department's effort to put together a proposal where we have no input on what the criteria, we have no feedback on what the criteria are going to be for the selection. I mean, we're wanting to be cooperative. We want to be part of this process, but kind of at every turn we're not. And how do we not assume we're going to have to put in a proposal separately, and we don't want to do that.
Thank you. Other thoughts specifically related to the specific discussion about the transparency or lack thereof and the process? Jed, please go ahead. Oh, Jed, if you're speaking, you're on mute.
Okay, I think if we could just think of it on a higher level for a minute. You think of the competitiveness of a nationwide application and just the clout that comes from a regional application. Hopefully it doesn't become such a competitive infighting between states or smaller projects, but what's realistic to compete on a nationwide level. I mean, that's idealistic, but hopefully that message is conveyed to all of the partners and able to put together a really fabulous concept plan that competes on a national level.
Thank you, Jed. That's a great reminder. Ken.
So everybody, or 76 people anyway, think they have projects, and that number, I guess, is probably going to go up. So we've been pretty open about what our project is. Most folks are not very open about what their projects are. If we're going to propose a regional hydrogen hub to DOE, my thought has been, and maybe somebody has a better idea, I'm wanting to hear it. My thought has been that we need to tie these projects, whether it's 76 of them or a dozen of them or 5 of them or 2 of them, we need to somehow take this patchwork and put them together into some kind of coherent quilt that describes what the DOE wants to see as a regional hydrogen hub that can actually interconnect to other regional hubs over time. And this holding things close to our chest, every project doing it, the commerce effort apparently doing it, is just poison to that. And I just, we need openness, or we need a different idea than the one I have in my head, and I just don't know what that is.
Thank you.
Becca, can I get Jed's hands up? And I'm not sure if it was an old hand up or if it's something new he wants to.
Thank you, Jessica.
So I do see a hand up from Sashwat.
Oh, wonderful.
Hi, Rebecca. Thanks for going over this today. This is Shashwat Roy with Renewable Northwest. Um, I'm just a little concerned about what the role of the advisory committee is. I feel like it's a much better kind of representation of, Washington and Oregon, like, folks developing projects, nonprofits, other entities, rather than the executive board itself. And it seems like the advisory committee has been kind of, their role has been kind of minimized or delayed. The executive board had started meeting since June or July, I'm assuming, and the advisory committee hasn't even met yet. And I'm not really sure of what role does the board or the organization itself see from the advisory committee. And it seems like the project selection criteria, timeline, the concepts, the technical concepts, all of this should be under the purview of the advisory committee, where project developers and other entities can kind of discuss these issues in an open forum. And we haven't even heard about when the first meeting is on the advisory committee. So I'm just wondering if it would be good to kind of push or kind of have a word with the executive board on what it sees the role of the advisory committee as, and get moving on that. So I think that would be my input on kind of having an increased role for the advisory committee, and having like particular areas of input where advisory committee would be more kind of in the know, especially related to project development. So I think that's my input. Thanks.
Thank you.
I see Greg's hands up. Go ahead, Greg.
Yeah, thank you. I was just going to add a note around the selection criteria. It sounds like it's not clear, exactly how those are going to be developed or when there might be. It sounds like there's a draft, but maybe there's not input. A lot of uncertainty there. My point for you, Rebecca, to kind of take back up north is just that those shouldn't just kind of stay secret. I mean, in one way or another, I think there's going to be a lot of people that are disappointed in this process because there's so much interest and there's a finite amount of dollars. And I think you need to have some transparency about the selection criteria, so people feel like they put their best foot forward. They knew how they were going to get graded to be in the Washington process. I think they have a PDF on their website right now of some evaluation criteria, but the list is basically just the stuff that anybody who's paying attention knows DOE has already said they care about. It doesn't actually tell you anything about how the Washington process will approach a Washington putting together a Washington process. So I just think some transparency and at least like a document that says, here's what the criteria are and here's what the weighting is at the very least, to make sure the process has some legitimacy to it, whether you succeed with the project or not.
Thank you, Greg.
I see Evan's hand is up now.
Hey, Evan.
Hey there. Thanks for the good meeting. I disconnected, so I missed the last few minutes, but just a little bit on my perspective of the biggest needs for this hub right now. I'm on the advisory committee, and there hasn't been much transparency as far as what our role will be, but I do expect there to be some kind of project review committee. But what I would encourage Odo to do here is, to Obsidian's credit and the concept that they've been developing, which does have an Oregon presence, they're not expecting to use these hub funds to subsidize projects to a large degree. They're really focused on using these hub funds for the maximum public good and to help stand up new sectors that can take advantage of hydrogen. So, I would encourage Odo and others to really think about, what is the highest and best use of these federal funds, whether it's opening up the transportation sector to hydrogen, facilitating shared infrastructure like pipelines or large-scale hydrogen storage, maybe building some liquefiers or other types of infrastructure that can benefit the entire region and its expansion into a national network.
Thank you, Evan.
I'm not seeing any more hands up right at the moment.
Evan's comment kind of bridged that the discussion about the association specifically, and then also kind of that idea of what we see as what the key attributes of a Pacific Northwest hub should be, and what it should be focused on. Does anyone have any other thoughts around that? It's already been decided that the hub will only include projects that are renewable energy and electrolysis. So that's the reason, and that's also in the Washington State legislative bill that authorized the creation of the association. So there's no room to maneuver there. So that's already been decided. But it's also looking like, based on the projects that came through the RFI, that it's going to be fairly transportation focused. But what are your thoughts for what other attributes you'd like to see, what these focuses should be? Are there specific technologies or benefits that we should be focusing on, kind of as Evan mentioned, like what do we see as, kind of the highest and best use of these funds?
Hey, Rebecca, I see Kate, Kelly, and then Ken all have their hands up. I think in that order is when they went up.
All right, Kate.
Thank you. So I've said this before to certainly to you, but I think it warrants kind of bringing up in this forum as well. I think, so I wanted to just describe not so much the specific focus in terms of the scientific and infrastructure direction, but maybe that second question, more so of when right now it looks like the advisory committee has broken up the hub into several of these kind of small working groups that span several different fields. I wanted to just reemphasize, I think, a structure that has been discussed at higher levels by our vice president for research, which is that considering the role that academics play as potentially a hub within the hub, where essentially, obviously, there's going to be major infrastructure, but if there was a way of facilitating or designing this hub that would allow us to leverage the scientific expertise, not only in the research scope that many of these projects are doing, but even more so in the kind of economics, environmental justice space, that being able to coordinate among the academic institutions in our region could be a really compelling way of making sure that we are showing that not only are we able to support the hub's development in the translation of this key technology and innovation, which is supported through many, many ways in universities, but also being really leads in providing that subject matter expertise and leadership on these other very critical components of the hub in social and environmental justice, labor, et cetera. So I know that previously, and you've heard me say this before, so I apologize, but this is a larger group. Thinking about all those different components and subcommittees within that advisory board is great, but it might be worth considering, is there a way that we could really leverage our academic institutions as such that we wouldn't expect significant funds or money to come out of that, but as a way of positioning our hub as taking advantage of the discovery, innovation, and expertise of our academic resources in a way that doesn't feel diffuse if they were just embedded across 1,000 different, not 1,000, I apologize, like several different small subsets. And so I just wanted to raise that here as a way that I could see us as a region being able to capitalize on that resource in a way that doesn't just look like we're tagging it on at the end in terms of social, environmental justice or labor, but having a dedicated, like, centralized connected system among academic institutions. So you've heard me say that before, but I wanted to share it with this group.
Thank you, Kate. And for those of you who don't know Kate, she's at the University of Oregon.
Thank you.
I think Kelly was next.
Kelly, Ken, Greg, and Alan, and I'll keep following up with you. But yes, Kelly was next.
Awesome. Thank you so much. So I'm Kelly Hale. I'm with the Eugene Water and Electric Board. And I just am trying to figure out, so we had submitted an original response to the RFI and trying to finalize some revisions to that before the Monday deadline, and just the comments that have come earlier, it just strikes me as I'm trying to understand what's highest and best use for the region. Obviously, your comment just a minute ago, Rebecca, struck me. Obviously, the focus on projects to date have been on transportation because that's where the credits are with Clean Fuels program in the state. As a utility, our interest is really about understanding how to make better use of currently curtailed renewable power and figuring out how to support the grid from a resiliency standpoint. And so I'm trying to figure out if feasibility studies would still be competitive in terms of how people are viewing this RFI and the resulting selection of projects to move forward into the actual application, or if, I think Ken was just mentioning, focusing on actual projects and utilizing the money for building of infrastructure, if that's more where the focus is interested in being. And without the specific criteria to know exactly what your project is being evaluated against, and with some of this being somewhat unknown because we don't have all of the details of exactly what this would cost or exactly, what the economics would be and which project would move forward. We have a lot of things that we're evaluating. And so I'm just curious about what you think about how to approach that for inclusion and for making sure that Oregon is getting the learnings that we need in our state and is still represented in the project moving forward.
Thanks, Kelly. That's a great question. And certainly based on what we've seen from USDOE thus far, it looks like they're really focusing on projects that can go right into the ground and get moving and can be self-sufficient over the course of about 8 years. There was talk in the notice of intent of setting aside $1 or $2 billion as kind of a technology opportunity, and kind of whether that would happen after the initial funding and phase of the hubs and the selection, it would be an add-on later or not. I got the impression they're still kind of thinking through what that might look like. So, there is probably some opportunity there. We won't know until we see the FOA, but I also am getting the impression from the association that the focus is very much on projects that can happen, right away and move forward, as opposed to, contributing to more of that research, development, and deployment. That said, should think that there would be an opportunity for smaller projects that are, kind of pilot project in nature that can provide some of that learning. But I think that definitely remains to be seen, kind of what we see in the FOA, and how much room they give us for building in some of that research and development. Jessica, who's next?
So up next, we've got Ken.
Ken.
Surprise. At the risk of saying what I think might be too obvious, I think you have to look first at what the US DOE's information that they've put out has said that they want, and they have absolutely stressed regional hubs. They've stressed equity and social justice, to Kate's point, and Obsidian's intent is to use most of the money to move in that direction. Transportation is really great, but it doesn't have the scale, and they've emphasized scale. So our project, even we didn't design it this way with we were doing this before the money came out, but our project includes a pipeline that would make low-cost hydrogen available for transportation. That doesn't have the scale at the moment to reach what the DOE is looking for. So scale is important. Diversity of end uses, especially hard to decarbonize areas. We're sort of focusing on ammonia to help decarbonize agriculture because it depends on nitrogen fertilizers from ammonia. And regional, I mean, they just, I keep saying that, but it's so important. We've talked with several folks on this in this meeting about how what we've envisioned as a hydrogen hub could facilitate what they're doing, and so that we're not just our project and their project, but we're a project together. And we've had other discussions with other parties who, they have good ideas, but they don't really want to share them. So I don't know how you put that together into a regional hub. And that's why I said earlier that this secrecy thing is kind of poison to what's needed. So those are my thoughts on what we need to do if we can't tell a cohesive story. And again, transportation is great, but that doesn't have the scale that DOE is seeking. So combining the some kind of scale with transportation, as we were trying to do, would be great. Now, we've gone out and had some of these conversations. Frankly, our bosses said, that's not our job. We're leaving that to the hydrogen hub group people, the commerce issue. But boy, I just don't see that happening there, and it's very concerning.
Rebecca, up next is Greg.
Thank you. Good morning. Again, I think that, as we think about the attributes of a hub, obviously it should be positioned to succeed and actually, secure funds, and so accomplish the right things that DOE wants to accomplish. I also think that, there are, as you know, Rebecca, because you've been writing a report on it, a lot of ways that hydrogen can be used. And I think in many ways, this hub opportunity is about, deployment and about, moving to scaling and about, commercializing and scaling so that you can actually push down, the cost of the technology. And so I think, it's important that the hub include, ideally multiple substantially sized, deployment projects in addition to, potentially some other smaller projects that help move the ball on other elements. You talked to the research component was coming up earlier, like that's one example. But I think, for as we look at, transportation sector, industrial heating opportunities, both are a little farther away, but still, kind of knocking on the door as we think about a big federal project like this. Same, also significant opportunities in the electricity sector. And so I think all those things should be on the table. I think it's, a deployment program ultimately, given its scope and scale and sort of the regional character that they've emphasized. And so, I think those elements, along with obviously some of the other emphases around, employment, workforce, environmental justice, all those kinds of things that are pretty important in any project. So I think, and I guess, for the point of this conversation too, that it should truly be regional, right? Like there should be substantial participation from both Washington and Oregon, and that should be part of the plan.
The last hand that I see up right now is Alan. So if anybody else has questions or comments, feel free to throw your hands up. And just a flag for those of you throwing comments into the chat. I'm documenting them, and we also will have access to the full chat after the end of this meeting. So we'll have that information documented as well.
Thanks. This is Alan Leto at TriMet. We put in a response to the RFI as a consumer, not as a producer. One of our 4 bus garages in the future, we plan to develop as a hydrogen fuel cell bus, and the projection is for us to ultimately be consuming about 9,000 kilograms at that location per day. And obviously we need to have some kind of idea of where it's coming from before we can do the design and all of that. I don't have a whole lot of background on this, so we're still learning, but definitely from my experience in other applications for federal funding, that core story of we've got a hub that has multiple producers, multiple users, a lot of coordination will be absolutely essential in being able to tell the sort of equity story. I think we hope that having transit as part of that will make a difference. Being able to provide access to needed locations for communities of concern, I hope will be part of the story. But it's hard not to agree with the last few statements, which is if we don't understand enough of the other projects, it's hard to really tell that story.
So Rebecca, I don't see any hands up right now, and Evan and Michelle and Jillian, I'm capturing your comments in my notes, which I will share with Rebecca at the end of the meeting.
And certainly if you've put any comments in the chat, but you wish to say them out loud and see if there's, agreement or additions to them from the folks here, by all means, the goal of this meeting, as I will just keep harassing you with, is that, to really get as much feedback from you as possible. And the next step is that Odo, we will take this feedback and we'll collaborate with our friends at Business Oregon to put this together to specific asks and feedback to the executive board and to Washington Department of Commerce with respect to what we'd like to see happen. And by we, I mean the Royal Oregon we.
Got a question from Chris in the chat. He says it's probably fair to say that this hub is going to largely benefit Washington. and it's clear that it is too late for Oregon to finance anything on its own this year. Is Odo looking at anything in the future for some kind of Oregon hub of its own legislature or something to kickstart things in Oregon? Can Odo take the lead here?
Chris, that's a great question. I agree with you. I think that every day the pie is getting a little bit more baked, and it's always been pretty heavily skewed towards Washington. I think part of that is an artifact of them being already pretty organized as a state and as a set of stakeholders. But also, I really can't discount the fact that their legislature was able to find $2 million to put towards this organization. So Oregon hasn't ponied up, so to speak, any cash. We also don't have, kind of the same, access, to different funding pots as them. Every state is different. So, if there were the possibility that we could get funding from the state legislature in Oregon to match what Washington is doing, that would be great. But as you can see, we're already pretty far down the road. So, unless we had it on good authority that could happen and we could give them an IOU for next session, I just don't see how any of that would work out. So I agree with you. I think you're right. I think that what happens with this hub will be skewed towards Washington. They put up the money, they created the organization. I think that for that reason, it's incumbent upon Oregon to try to push back as much as possible to find that opportunity for true collaboration. But if if Oregon stakeholders have concerns about how this is going, and maybe start to decide that they wish to go it on their own or form their own group, I think that that's always within the realm of possibility. Odo, with respect to leadership, we're not currently staffed to, I think, be able to take on leading something like that. We don't have the funding that Washington did to go out and hire a contractor with experience doing a multi-million-dollar funding proposal to the federal government. I don't see that as a possibility. I think that certainly Odo could be a part of something, but I think it would be a really tall order. Unless, if there were direction from the governor or the legislature, then obviously that would be different.
Rebecca, if I could add to this, I think there's one other leg to that stool, which is Washington State has developed a pretty robust strategy for what their future energy state needs to look like. And when it comes to hydrogen, I think that there's not a consistent message that we can put out that this is what Oregon is looking for in our future energy state. And so that's another area where I think it makes it a little more difficult for Oregon to move forward and take that leadership role to figure out how we could be bring a great part of that hub to the Pacific Northwest. So I think there are a number of legs that could use some building. I'm totally mixing my metaphors, but hopefully it's making sense.
Thank you, Jessica. Evan.
I see Evan's hand.
Yeah, thanks. Just, I wanted to highlight that while Washington may be ahead, in terms of allocating some funds from the state and having some supportive legislative policies, it's by no means too late for Oregon to get involved or to be a part of this hub application. You know, the PNHA organization that was created in Washington went through some last minute changes. And, you know, I want to remind folks that this hub is going to be led by the private sector. You know, we are talking about multi-billion-dollar investments being made that the match funding and those investments are not coming from government. They're coming from the private sector. And so that's why PNHA was set up as a public-private entity. So while Oregon as a government might not have as many goals or strategies in place, we still have an opportunity to you know, have the private sector step in and play a big role here. And so what government can do is, you know, work towards these goals and collaborate with the private sector to, you know, catch up to where Washington is. And I don't think that's unreasonable. What Jillian put in the chat here is DOE has forecasted this hub timeline to be possibly an 8 to 10 year timeline. So we are just getting started now. And if we're a little bit behind, you know, we shouldn't feel discouraged that we're out of the running to do something meaningful in this state.
Thank you, Evan. That was very glass half full. I appreciate that.
And you know, one last comment too. You know, the hub is not the be all end all of the hydrogen opportunity. You know, Oregon could go through this hub process and, you know, get goose egged with zero funding directed into the state. But now that we have the IRA supporting clean hydrogen, you know, there are many more opportunities today than there were even a few months ago. And so we can still march forward in this direction with or without hub support and still be impactful.
Evan, I'm so glad that you added that, because, you know, our vision for gathering all of you together and other interested stakeholders in Oregon is that this isn't only for the hub opportunity. You know, Washington was relatively more organized, you know, its stakeholders, because they'd sort of, you know, kind of already been talking about hydrogen. They knew kind of who the players were. So this is overall our opportunity to become highly organized for the hub opportunity, but beyond it. And so that kind of goes into another question that I had for everyone here is, you know, as this convening of stakeholders that was envisioned between Business Oregon and Odo, you know, would love to hear more about what your ideas are for how this can be, you know, maximally useful. And, you know, as part of that, we're certainly trying to be complementary to other efforts that are happening. You know, Renewable Hydrogen Association is here today. They're going to be doing some convening as well. We've been working with Blue Green Alliance on some convenings with labor. So we're certainly trying to also collaborate with other groups in the space doing similar work to make sure that we're not duplicating effort. But beyond that, is this the sort of thing that, you know, we've had a great meeting today. I can put together some, you know, some material for Odo that we can then go to the association with and get feedback on, and I can come back to you and report back, and we can be on our way. Or we could, you know, make this a semi-regular meeting. We could have, you know, subcommittees focused on specific parts of the application and or on specific parts of dealing with the association that, you know, we have concerns and ideas around. You know, really, there's no kind of single vision, you know, that we've lit upon. We really wanted to come today and ask you what Odo and Business Oregon could do with this convening, and what you'd like to see, and how we can best meet your needs for organization and information flow and you know, sending feedback back to the association, but then also beyond that to just hydrogen in general. So, you know, if you have thoughts on that today, I'd love to hear them. If you want to follow up, you want to think about it and follow up with me, great too. But, you know, that's really, I would very much love to hear your thoughts on that.
Hey, Rebecca, as people ponder that question, there was one final question in the last subject from Chris at Northwest Natural, and he asked, Hub Awards are likely going to be highly political. How plugged in is the Oregon delegation in this effort? And do you know how plugged in the Washington delegation is by chance? And then if you do want to answer Rebecca's current question about how Odo can help continue the conversation around hydrogen in general, throw your hand up or put it in the question in the chat, and I'll happily organize that. And Evan, I don't know if your hand's up for this new discussion or if it's just from the last one. So great. Okay. Chris's question. Okay.
That's a great question, Chris. You know, I don't have a lot of insight into that. I certainly not about what's going on with the Washington delegation. You know, Odo has not had any specific communication with the Oregon delegation. If anyone here has and wants to talk about it, that would be certainly great. But otherwise, that's definitely an area that we could add for follow-up.
So Rebecca, Kelly at eWeb said that Odo seems like the natural convener of information and a matchmaker between possible partners in the hydrogen space. It would be helpful to have visibility into some of the other projects happening in the region and how we could learn from them or partner with them as appropriate.
Great, thank you, Kelly.
I'm not seeing any other hands raised or questions in the chat. Martina posted a comment regarding your question about moving forward. I believe it would be helpful for the sector to have a regular interagency meeting or have regular interagency meetings to make sure various agencies communicate and are up to date. And Thomas says, first I had heard that Hub, this is the first I had heard that the Hub will likely be focused on transportation. It makes sense as it can be a near-term volume market for regionally produced hydrogen. I'm still perplexed that there is not representation from transportation on the executive board, maritime transit or heavy duty freight. And Jillian concurred with that statement from Thomas. And now I see Thomas's hand is up, so maybe he wants to add to that.
Uh-oh, Thomas, your voice is a little high. It might be an issue with your speaker. Am I the only one having that problem?
No, in all honesty, Thomas sounds like a chipmunk speeded up. So I don't know what's going on, Thomas, but I can't hear or understand anything. Thomas is going to log out and come back in.
Okay, sorry about that.
While he's doing that, I don't see any other hands raised. Any comments at the moment?
Jillian.
Hi, yes, can you hear me?
Yes.
All right, great. So this is Jillian from the Oregon Department of Transportation. Thank you, Rebecca and Jessica, for having this meeting. I just want to get back to your question about next steps here and say that I agree with what both Kelly and Martina put in the chat. I think Odo is a natural convener in this space. And that I do want to just highlight that there are other opportunities beyond the hydrogen hub. Like if we go back to the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act, there's section 11401 grants. That's something ODOT as an agency is heavily focused on. Obviously, it's transportation focused, but we're going to be looking for partners and looking to generate some grant concepts there. So having some sort of communication among all stakeholders in the state to just start having these conversations about potential grant opportunities and how we can work together and partner would be great. And I think if ODO can lead that effort, we would certainly welcome that. And I'll also just add back to my other comment too about if they do release this hydrogen hub funding in multiple rounds, that's a natural next step as well, is how can we be more prepared for that second round of funding. So that's something we can continue to work on in the interim.
Thanks, Jillian. I see Thomas is back and has his hand raised. So let's try it again, Thomas, see if we can hear you better.
All right, hopefully this is more normal.
Perfect.
You sound great.
Okay, thank you. I just wanted to elaborate on the comment about transportation. I know that over the last couple of years, there's been some focus here. I know Clean Cities did a really good webinar about a little less than a year ago with all the transit agencies from Oregon and Washington. I know that what's near term, what's available right now is transit buses. In maybe the next 5 years, there may be heavy duty transportation freight. And recently at the GTSC meeting in Tacoma, there was a panel that had Kenworth, PACCAR, which is in Washington, Daimler, which is here in Portland, Navistar and Volvo were on that panel, and they talked a little bit about hydrogen. And Daimler in particular mentioned that they are partnered with Black & Veatch and NextEra Energy to develop fueling sites along corridors. We're all familiar with alternative fuel corridors through the NEVI program and whatnot. And they said that they were looking at developing battery, like megawatt charging sites with hydrogen. So when you look at that and the volume that could be consumed by heavy duty freight, especially along I-5, could get big over time. So I'm just kind of surprised that there's not representation from transit that could be near term involved from the heavy duty freight, especially that they're in the region. And there was also some talk about the benefit of talking about connecting to the California hub along I-5 with heavy duty freight. And, that could be a benefit maybe to the application. So I just wanted to add those couple of points.
Thank you.
Hey, Rebecca, can I ask a follow-up question of Thomas? When you were talking, I'm taking notes and I may have misheard something. So I just want to clarify, did you say that Daimler's interested in putting in battery charging stations that are fueled by hydrogen, or putting in hydrogen fueling stations to support vehicles running up and down I-5?
What they said is that they are looking at pairing both electric charging stations for battery freight and hydrogen fueling for fuel cell freight.
Great. Thanks. Appreciate it.
One other comment too that now that I'm thinking about it, maritime transportation is huge, right? And I'm sure there's no question that I think there's maybe at least one ferry that's hydrogen powered now built in Washington. So, there is connectivity too with the Columbia River between, Puget Sound and Oregon. So I don't know where the focus is with the different maritime groups, but maritime transportation doesn't seem to be represented on the executive board either.
Thanks, Thomas. Thanks for the clarification too. Appreciate it. Kelly added a comment in the chat. Rebecca, I really welcome the focus on low carbon hydrogen. At EWEB, we're really focused on defining our interest in the types of hydrogen projects that are of highest value to our interests. it would be helpful to have some of those discussions at the state level to ensure that the federal and state investments being made on hydrogen actually lead to accomplishments in achieving a low carbon future as quickly as possible due to the urgency of climate change. I say this because I want to be careful that we are applying projects and funding to the highest leverage projects that can address climate change.
Thank you, Kelly. And I think that speaks, to the point that Jessica made earlier that, if Oregon were to develop a statewide energy strategy, then that would definitely be a conversation that we would want to have in terms of what, can the state agree upon what approach it wants to take? Should there be intermediate steps with low carbon hydrogen, or maybe that's just one of the two paths, or should the focus be only on renewable hydrogen? I've heard a lot of arguments, for both, either or. So, I agree that that's an area where I think that there's a lot more discussion that should happen in Oregon, kind of, to come to some consensus about, what we as the state define as the best and highest use.
Thomas added to that only the lower carbon hydrogen is going to qualify for the production tax credit of $3 per kilogram. So another important piece of that puzzle.
Yeah, that's a great point.
Oh, and Kelly added to that, getting clarification on the carbon accounting to determine what is low carbon hydrogen will be really important.
Agreed.
So if I'm not mistaken, I think Thomas's hand is left up from a prior point. I don't see any other hands up or any comments in the chat.
Kelly.
Can I actually ask a question about what you're seeing related to the carbon accounting, in the $3 kilogram PTC? My understanding of carbon accounting in the utility world and as it relates to these types of projects is that, average emissions factors have been applied for a year on average for different utilities, different electricity mixes, and I'm trying to figure out how you would actually get to above the 60-cent threshold for the PTC because it requires it to be very low, and trying to understand like how you would tie a particular renewable source to a project in order to do that. Is that going to be just like the regular clean fuels pathway process of approving a pathway, or are there going to be other carbon accounting methods that we should know about, or who's making those decisions, or do you have any insight into any of how that is playing out in terms of taking what's in that the IRA with the PTC rules and figuring out how to get to that very low carbon threshold that would get you the higher levels of incentive?
Kelly, that's a great question. And that's something that I have been trying to follow, and I just haven't heard a lot of action, frankly. I think that there was a hope amongst some that the federal government might adopt the direction that the EU was going in with respect to the requirements for additionality and hourly matching with respect to electricity. The EU has since jettisoned that as part of their approach. So I don't know if that has any bearing on what the federal government decides or not. I know Odo, along with many of you, were really concerned when we saw the infrastructure bill, and they suggested a carbon intensity only at the point of production, which isn't a true carbon intensity. And then I believe it was the most recent DOE notice of intent with respect to the hub that they did make clear that they were actually going to look at a true carbon intensity. But again, your question with respect to, you know, what will that electricity matching look like? Will it be a grid average? Will it be a specific utility average? Will it be, you know, hourly matched renewables? Will, you know, will RECs be allowed to demonstrate that? I don't know what that's shaping up to be, but I think that that's going to be, you know, a really important area. And if there's an opportunity for public comment, I would hope that Odo, we might have the capacity to get folks together to comment, Oregon stakeholders.
Rebecca, we got some additional comments. Thomas said, also mentioned earlier, but Oregon, Washington, California, and British Columbia have clean fuel programs that with the $3 PTC could drive the cost of green hydrogen for transportation below the cost of petroleum diesel. Chris from Northwest Natural said for the PTC, and you, oh, sorry, people are typing as fast as I can read. The carbon accounting will be based on the GREET model. This is prescribed in the IRA bill. Chris says for the PTC anyway, and I can only imagine this will drive hub economics. And that was followed by Evan, who said the difference in the carbon intensity pathway for hydrogen incentives under the IRA is the calculation stops at the point of production, whereas under the low carbon fuel standard, the calculation goes to the wheels of the vehicle. So it sounds like the CI pathway is tailpipe instead of life cycle for the IRA. And then Ken added grid average power will not qualify, even BPA's power. So the rules around what counts, local renewables, contracted renewables, RECs, et cetera, are absolutely key. Making it the Treasury needs to be a focal point. I see Evan's hand up. Is that?
Yeah, I'll just elaborate a little bit. And, you know, Kelly, you're right that this is a really big deal, how this is all calculated. And Ken points out that a lot of these details will come down into rulemaking. From what I've seen, I did some calculations based on CI pathways for Oregon utilities. There's some natural gas in the BPA mix, and I was coming out with about 1.5 kilograms of CO2 per kilogram of hydrogen, which puts you right on the threshold of $1 a kilogram PTC, or even down to 60 cents a kilogram PTC at that range. So I'm in the process of finding a consultant to validate some of these calculations for the grid power, basically. And I think it will be lower because, like I mentioned in chat, it doesn't, the CI pathway is different. It'll include less carbon because you're not counting the transportation of that fuel to the vehicle and then the efficiency of that vehicle. But I don't know if we'll be able to get that full $3 PTC based on grid power. So it really boils down to, well, how are you able to serve electrolysis with renewable power, and do RECs count? Because currently they do allow book and claim of renewable gas attributes to methane reformers, and that can create a negative CI. So unfortunately, that could disadvantage electrolysis to RNG book and claim if we don't have similar options for renewable electricity supply. So there's a lot to be sorted out in the rulemaking.
Thanks, Evan.
Chris added to that, it's his understanding that RECs will be acceptable. At least that's what the staff who wrote that part of the bill told him. So FYI.
So I want to wrap up a little bit what we've discussed today and what I see as the next steps. So I have a lot of feedback from you folks, specifically on the hub opportunity of concerns and suggestions that you would like shared with the association and the executive board. So what I am proposing is that Odo will put those together into some kind of communication that we can then share with the board and the executive board, with the executive board and the association and commerce to get feedback, which we would then share with everyone else here. It's, you know, we've heard some agreement that Odo would be a natural convener of this conversation on an ongoing basis. So I think that in the near term, certainly I'll collaborate with ODOT and other state agencies to see about what the other grant opportunities are and to see when it might be appropriate to have a next meeting about that. I can certainly look at scheduling another meeting in the next couple of weeks or next month, or as soon as we receive feedback from the executive board and the association. Does that sound reasonable? Go ahead. Let's see. I think Jessica, do you know whose hand was up first?
Evans was, but I think it might be a holdover. Yep, Alan then.
Oh, you're on mute, Alan.
Thank you. My comment was only partially related to that. I think it'd be great if you reconvened. I also wonder if there's a possibility at some point in some group meeting with a representative from Washington State to sort of pepper them with some of the questions so you don't have to be the go-between, and see if they can, you know, fill in the gaps a little bit more for us. I don't know if that would be helpful or not. I'm not dead set on it if others think it's a bad idea, but just wanted to throw that out.
I mean, I think, you know, you're not the only one to say that. I think Greg said earlier it was a shame that we didn't have someone here from, you know, from Washington. So I think that that's perfectly reasonable to add as one of the requests, one of the asks.
Yeah, and it will say something unfortunate if they can't meet that, but I think it'd be great to ask.
And I'll add to that, Rebecca, that Kelly mentioned it would be great if at a future meeting, Odo could help provide some information sort of about this question on the definitions of what constitutes renewable hydrogen, low carbon hydrogen, and what information we have, the various bills and programs in Oregon that might have implications for this.
Great.
I'm not seeing any other hands right now or comments.
Well, I'd really like to thank you all for your time today and your consideration. If you weren't on the original invite, I apologize. You know, we were trying to get this meeting off the ground quickly, and you know, any exclusions were accidental and utterly my fault. And certainly, if you think that there are other people or organizations who would be good additions to this group of Oregon stakeholders interested in hydrogen, by all means, send me their names, or they can sign up. You know, at Odo, there's a number of ways to make sure that they're included going forward. And again, please don't hesitate to follow up with me via email or phone if you'd like to discuss further. I will be in touch as Odo develops our comments back to the Washington Department of Commerce, and as we await feedback from them, and certainly we'll look to schedule a next meeting here soon. So thank you all for being here today and for your feedback. And I'm looking forward to continuing to work with you, because it sounds like we're definitely going to have some future meetings. So thank you and have a great Friday.